Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're looking at something that, well, to be honest, doesn't sound all that exciting at first glance, banks. But stick with us because the paper we're diving into today, Banks as Secret Keepers, makes a pretty fascinating argument. It basically says that the fact that banks are a little bit, secretive actually helps you, the everyday person who uses them.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
You hear all the time these days about how transparency is good, especially with finances.
Right.
But this paper is saying that when it comes to banks, a little bit of mystery actually helps everything run smoothly.
Okay, I'm intrigued, I gotta admit, but color me skeptical, I guess.
Yeah.
How can having less information be better when it comes to my money?
Well, think of it this way. Banks make money by taking on risk, right?
Right.
They lend out your deposits
Yeah.
and hope to earn more interest than they pay you. It's a balancing act.
Yeah, for sure.
So how do they manage that risk without making everyone nervous that their money's just going to disappear?
Okay, yeah, that's the question.
That's where the secrecy comes in. Like, imagine a bank lends money for this huge construction project. Now, if every little detail about that loan was public knowledge, you could have all these investors coming in and analyzing it and potentially making moves that could really destabilize the bank.
Are we talking about like hedge funds here?
Exactly. Those are the kinds of players who might see an opportunity to, buy up the good parts of a loan or bet against the bad parts.
Oh, wow.
And that kind of activity could create this ripple effect. Makes things unpredictable for the bank and for you ultimately.
So the bank's secrecy is kind of like a shield, protecting regular people from like the chaos of the market.
That's a great way to put it. The paper calls it the trade-off between safe liquidity and risky liquidity. Like your bank account, it needs to be a safe haven,
Yeah.
like a money-like asset that you can always rely on. But that stability depends on banks managing risk in a way that isn't always totally transparent.
Okay, this is starting to click, but I'm also thinking about the downsides, Does this mean banks can just do whatever they want behind closed doors because no one's watching?
Well, not exactly. The paper does say there are costs to this secrecy.
Okay.
Think about it this way. Sometimes banks might have to hold back on lending, even for good projects, just to maintain that opacity.
So there's like trade-offs with everything?
Yeah.
But how does a bank keep all this information secret? I mean, it's not like they're hiding bags of cash under a mattress, right?
Right. It's more about keeping certain details about their loans confidential. Complex legal structures, data protection measures, even just like a culture of discretion among employees. It's not about being sneaky. It's about managing risk in a way that helps everyone in the long run.
So it's not about hiding anything bad. It's more like creating a buffer zone.
Right.
But doesn't that mean that we as the people using banks don't know as much about what's happening with our money?
It does, and that's a fair point. The paper acknowledges that this lack of transparency can sometimes lead to problems, especially if banks aren't being managed well. But you have to remember, we're talking about a system that's designed to balance two things: stability and profitability.
Okay, so how do we know if that balance is actually fair? How do we make sure banks aren't just taking advantage of all this secrecy?
That's where regulation comes in.
Okay.
Things like reserve requirements and capital adequacy ratios, those aren't just bureaucratic hurdles. They're safeguards to make sure banks are keeping enough back to cover potential losses.
So those regulations are kind of working in our favor, even though they might seem complicated.
Exactly. They're all part of keeping the financial system stable and predictable.
Yeah.
And that predictability is what lets us use our bank accounts without constantly worrying about what the market's doing.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's go back to those hedge funds for a second if banks are being so careful. How do those super savvy investors still manage to make money? I mean, they're not just sitting around doing nothing, right?
No, of course not. They're still playing the game.
Yeah.
But they're focused on areas where information is more readily available. Think about the stock market, for example.
Yeah.
Companies listed there have to disclose a lot of information publicly, which gives investors a much clearer picture of how they're doing.
So it's like they're playing in a different sandbox with different rules.
Exactly. And that's a key takeaway from this paper. Different parts of the financial system work under different rules. Banks are really good at providing safe liquidity, while markets are all about transparency and price discovery.
So it's like they each have their own strengths and weaknesses, and they kind of complement each other.
That's a great way to put it, and it highlights why it's so important to understand the nuances of how all these different players operate.
So where does all this leave us, the everyday people just trying to use the financial system? What's the big takeaway?
The big takeaway is that a little bit of mystery can actually be a good thing.
Really?
It might seem counterintuitive, but that lack of total transparency is a big part of what makes banking so reliable.
So we actually benefit from not knowing every little thing that's going on behind the scenes.
In a way, yes, think about it like this. You don't need to know exactly how your car engine works to drive to the store.
Hmm.
You just need to trust that it'll get you there. In the same way, you don't need to be a financial whiz to use your bank account. Just understand the basics and trust that the system's designed to protect you.
That's a really helpful analogy. But this paper also mentioned costs of secrecy, right? What were those again?
Right? One of the main costs is that banks sometimes have to limit lending, even for potentially good projects, just to maintain that opacity. And this means some businesses might struggle to get the funding they need.
So it's a trade-off between stability and access to capital.
Exactly, and that trade-off can be tough. But the paper argues that for most people, the benefits of having a stable banking system outweigh the costs.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the whole picture here, but it makes me wonder, how do companies actually decide if they should go to a bank for funding or try their luck in the markets? What factors go into that choice?
That's a great question, and the paper looks at it in detail. It suggests that companies with projects that are harder to understand or evaluate are more likely to go with bank financing.
So like a company with a really complex, cutting-edge project might be better off working with a bank that can understand and manage the risks involved.
Exactly. Banks have expertise in assessing those kinds of projects. And being able to keep some details confidential can be a real plus for companies working on sensitive or rapidly changing stuff.
It's like they're choosing a partner who can give them the money, but also gets what they're doing and can protect their trade secrets and stuff.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. And it really shows the unique role that banks play in the whole financial world. They aren't just lenders. They're more like information gatekeepers, helping to make sure that money goes to the projects that really need it, even if those projects are a little bit, hush-hush.
This has been so interesting. I feel like I finally understand why banks do things the way they do. It's not just about making profits. It's about managing risk, keeping things stable, and helping new ideas grow in a way that works for everyone.
Exactly, and it shows that sometimes keeping some things secret can actually be good, especially for something as important as our financial system.
So to wrap things up, let's go back to that question you asked earlier about how companies choose between going to a bank for funding or trying the markets. What advice would you give to someone facing that decision? What are the key things they should think about?
That's a great question to end on. I think the most important thing is to really understand your project. If it's something pretty straightforward, where you can easily measure the risks and the potential rewards, then going to the markets might be a good option. You'll have access to a lot more investors and you could get better terms.
Okay.
But if your project is really complex or innovative, or if it involves information that needs to be kept confidential, then a bank might be a better partner.
So it comes down to finding the right fit for your specific needs and what you're trying to do.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask for expert advice.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to financial advisors, mentors, people who've been there before. They can help you weigh the pros and cons and make the right decision for you.
That's great advice. I think we've given everyone a lot to think about today. We've busted some myths about banks, explored the surprising upside of secrecy, and learned how to navigate the sometimes confusing world of financing. I feel like my financial IQ has gone up a few points, and I hope our listeners feel the same way.
It's been great talking about this. Remember, knowledge is power, even when it comes to something like banking that might seem a bit boring.
That's a great way to put it. Until next time, keep those brains working and keep those questions coming.